Good morning. I'm going to pick up where I left off. I'm just going to try to make it look like what it needs to look like. Okay, so this is the formation of a national government. The 13 American colonies became the 13 United States of America in 1783 following their war for independence from Britain. Before the war ended, they ratified a framework for their common efforts. These Articles of Confederation provided a union, but an extremely loose and fragile one. George Washington called it a rope of sand. Okay. There was no common currencies. Individual states still produced their own. There was no national military force. Many states still had their own armies and navies. There was little centralized control over foreign policy. States negotiated directly with other countries, and there was no national system for imposing and collecting taxes. Disputes between Maryland and Virginia over navigation rights on the Potomac River, which formed their common border, led to a conference of 5 states in Annapolis, Maryland, in 1786. Alexander Hamilton, a delegate from New York, said that such commercial issues were part of a larger economic and political questions which was needed. He said was a rethinking of the Confederation. He and other delegates proposed holding a convention to do just that. Support from Washington, unquestionably the most trusted man in America, won over those who thought the idea was too bold. The gathering in Philadelphia in May 1787 was remarkable. The 55 delegates elected to the convention had experience in colonial and state government. Now, this is the historic room in Independence Hall, Philadelphia, where the delegates drafted the Constitution of the United States in the summer of 1787. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land. This is the room where it all started. They were knowledgeable in history, law, and political theory. And knowledgeable means they were clever invaders. Now, most were young, but the group included the elderly Benjamin Franklin, who was nearing the end of an extraordinary career of public service and scientific achievement. 2 notable Americans were not there, and these were Thomas Jefferson. He was in Paris as an American ambassador to France, and John Adams, he was in London as an ambassador to Great Britain. Now, the Continental Congress had authorized the convention to amend the Articles of Confederation. Instead, the delegates threw aside the articles, judging them inadequate for the needs of the new nation, and devised a new form of government based on the separation of legislative, executive, and judicial powers. The gathering had become a constitutional convention, reaching consensus on some of the details of a new Constitution would prove extremely difficult. Many delegates argued for a strong national government that limited states' rights. Others argued equally persuasively for a weak national government that preserved state authority. Some delegates feared that Americans were not wise enough to govern themselves, and so opposed any sort of popular elections. Others thought the national government should have as broad a popular base as possible. Representatives from small states insisted on equal representation in a national legislature. Those from big states thought they deserved to have more influence. Representatives from states where slavery was illegal hoped to, let me guess, they hoped to make it legal? Hoped to outlaw it. Those from slave states rejected any attempts to do so. Some delegates wanted to limit the number of states in the Union. Others supported statehood. Others supported statehood for the newly settled lands to the west. I'm going to go back to the pictures. The famous Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, an enduring symbol of American freedom, first rung on July 8, 1776 to celebrate the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. It cracked in 1836 during the funeral of John Marshall, Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. It was cracked probably already. Now, this is the original of the U.S. Constitution signed in by the delegates in Philadelphia on September 17, 1787. And this is, of course, a mother and daughter viewing the documents in the exhibition hall of the National Archives. The U.S. Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and the Bill of Rights are on display in this Washington, D.C. building. Right. Y'all notice my tone change, right? Now, as I said, those who outlawed slavery, I thought that they, were trying to legalize it, said they were fighting to outlaw it. And those from slave states rejected any attempts to do so. Now, some delegates wanted to limit the number of states in the Union. Sorry, I was up late reading the first pages of this. Sorry. My apologies. Others supported statehood for newly settled lands to the west. Every question raised new divisions, and each was resolved by compromise. Now, the draft Constitution was not a long document, yet it provided the framework for most complex government, yet devised the national government would have full power to issue currency, levy taxes, grant patents, conduct foreign policy, maintain an army, establish post offices, and wage war. And it would have three equal branches: a Congress, a president, and a court system with balanced powers and checks against each other's actions. Economic interests influenced the course of the debate on the document, but so did state, sectional, and ideological interests. Also important was the idealism of the men who wrote it. They believed they had designed a government that would promote individual liberty and public virtue. On September 17, 1787, after 4 months of deliberation, a majority of delegates signed the new Constitution. They agreed it would become the law of the land when 9 of the 13 states had ratified it. The ratification process lasted about a year. Opponents voiced fears that strong central government could become out of control, could become tyrannical and oppressive. Proponents responded that the system of checks and balances would prevent this from happening. The debate brought into existence two factions: the Federalists, who favored a strong central government and who supported the Constitution, and the Anti-Federalists, who favored a loose association of states and who opposed the Constitution. Even after the Constitution was ratified, many Americans felt it lacked an essential element. They said it did not enumerate the rights of individuals. When the first Congress met in New York City in September 1789, lawmakers agreed to add these provisions. It took another 2 years before these 10 amendments, collectively known as the Bill of Rights, became a part of the Constitution. The first 10 amendments guarantees freedom of speech, press, religion, the right to protest, assemble peacefully, and demand changes. The fourth protects against unreasonable searches and arrests. The fifth provides for due process of law in all criminal cases. The sixth guarantees the right to a fair and speedy trial. And the eighth protects against cruel and unusual punishment. Since the Bill of Rights was adopted more than 200 years ago, only 17 more amendments have been added to the Constitution. And these are the early years' westward expansion and regional differences. They just were taking over. George Washington was sworn in as the first president of the United States on April 30th, 1789. He had been in charge of organizing an effective military force during the Revolution. Now he was in charge of building a functioning government. He worked with Congress to create departments of state treasury, justice, and war. The heads of those departments would serve as presidential advisors, his cabinet. A Supreme Court composed of 1 Chief Justice and 5 Associate Justices was established together with 3 circuit courts and 13 district courts. Policies were developed for administering the Western territories and bringing them into the Union as new states. Washington served 2 4-year terms and then left office, setting a precedent that eventually became law. The next 2 presidents, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, represented two schools of thought on the role of government. The divergence led to the formation of the first political parties in the Western world. The Federalists, led by Adams and Alexander Hamilton, Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, generally represented trade and manufacturing interests. They feared anarchy and believed in a strong central government that could set national economic policies and maintain order. They had the most support in the North. Republicans, led by Jefferson, generally represented agricultural interests. They opposed a strong central government and believed in states' rights and the self-sufficiency of farmers. They had the most support in the South. For about 20 years, the young nation was able to thrive in relative peace. Its policy was to be friendly and impartial to all other nations. However, it was not immune from political developments in Europe, particularly in Britain and France, which were at war. The British Navy seized American ships headed to France, and the French Navy seized American ships headed to Britain. Various diplomatic negotiations averted hostilities during the 1790s and early 1800s, but it seemed only a matter of time before the United States will have to defend its interests. War with Britain came in 1812. Fighting took place mostly in the northeastern states and along the East Coast. One British expeditionary force reached the new capital of Washington in the District of Columbia. It set fire to the executive mansion, causing President James Madison to flee and left the city in flames. But the U.S. Army and Navy won enough decisive battles to claim victory. After 2.5 years of fighting and with treasury depleted by a separate war with France, Britain signed a peace treaty with the United States. The U.S. victory ended once and for all any British hopes of reestablishing influence in the south of the U.S. victory ended once and for all any British hopes of reestablishing influence south of the Canadian border. By the time the War of 1812 ended, many of the serious difficulties faced by the new American Republic had disappeared. National union under the Constitution brought a balance between liberty and order. A low national debt, a continent awaiting exploration presented the prospect of peace, prosperity, and social progress. Right. On top of other people, right? Right. The most significant event in foreign policy was pronouncement by the President James Monroe expressing, and my grandfather is from Monroe, Georgia. Okay. I'm just now learning who all these people are. Now, James Monroe expressing U.S. solidarity with the newly independent nations of Central and South America. The Monroe Doctrine warned against any further attempts by Europe to colonize Latin America. Many of the new nations in turn expressed their political affinity with the United States by basing their constitutions on the North American model. The United States doubled in size with the purchase of Louisiana Territory from France in 1803 and Florida from Spain in 1819. From 1816 to 1821, 6 new states were created. Between 1812 and 1852, the population tripled. The young nation's size and diversity defied easy generalization. It also invited contradiction. The United States was a contrary of both civilized cities built on commerce and industry and primitive frontiers where the rule of the law was often ignored. It was a society that loved freedom but permitted slavery. The Constitution held all these different parts together. The strains, however, were growing. And this is a picture of Henry Clay of Kentucky. Although never president, was one of the most influential American politicians of the first half of the 19th century. Clay became indispensable for his role in preserving the Union with the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and the Compromise of 1850. Both pieces of legislation resolved for a time disputes over slavery in the territories. And this is sectional conflict. The United States in 1850 was a huge nation stretched between two oceans. Wide differences in geography, natural resources, and development were obvious from region to region. New England and the Middle Atlantic states were the main centers of finance, commerce, and manufacturing. Principal products included textiles and clothing, lumber and machinery. Maritime trade flourished. The southern states were chiefly agricultural, producing tobacco, sugar, and cotton with slave labor. The middle western states were agricultural too, but their grain and meat products came from the hands of free men and women. In 1819, Missouri had applied for a statehood. Northerners objected because there were 10,000 slaves there. Congressman Henry Clay of Kentucky proposed a compromise. Missouri would enter the Union and continue to permit slavery, while Maine would enter as a free state. Regional positions on the issue hardened in the decades following the Missouri Compromise. In the North, the movement to abolish slavery was vocal and grew increasingly powerful. In the South, the belief in white supremacy and maintaining the economic status quo was equally vocal and powerful. Although thousands of slaves escaped north through a network of secret routes known as the Underground Railroad, slaves still comprised a third of the population in slave states at the time of the 1860 census. Most Northerners were unwilling to challenge the existence of slavery in the South, yet many opposed its expansion into the Western territories. And Southerners felt just as strongly that the territories themselves Southerners felt just as strongly that the territories themselves had the right to decide their status. A young politician from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln, felt that the issue was national, not a local one. A house divided against itself. Let me guess. Cannot stand. Oh, cannot stand, he said. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. In 1860, the Republican Party nominated Lincoln as its candidate for president on an anti-slavery platform. In a four-man race, he won only 39% of the popular vote, but a clear majority of votes in the electoral college. The Electoral College is the group of citizens who directly elect the U.S. president following the popular vote. So there's that right there is what do I call it? Confirmation that your vote just doesn't count. All right, so we're moving on. The storm that had been gathering for decades was about to explode with brutal force. Southern states had threatened to leave the Union if Lincoln were elected. The secession started even before he was sworn in. It would be up to the new president to try to hold the Union together. And this is the Civil War and post-war Reconstruction. North and South went to war in April 1861. The Southern states had claimed the right to secede and had formed their own confederacy. Their forces fired the first shots. The Northern states, under the leadership of President Lincoln, were determined to stop the rebellion and preserve the Union. The North had more than twice as many states and twice as many people. It had abundant facilities for producing war supplies, as well as a superior railway network. Now we built. The South had more experienced military leaders and had the advantage of fighting mostly on its own territory. For 4 years, ground battles involving tens of thousands of soldiers and horses were fought in Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, and Georgia. Naval battles were fought off the Atlantic coast and on the Mississippi River in that area. Union forces won an almost uninterrupted series of victories in Virginia. By contrast, they met defeat after defeat in their attempts to capture Richmond, the Confederate capital. Now, we're going to go back up so you can see the pictures. This is President Abraham Lincoln Center at a Union Army encampment in October 1862 following the Battle of Antietam. And then, excuse me, I'm so sorry. This is a slave family picking cotton near Savannah, Georgia in the early 1860s. My ancestors. And this is a Confederate dead along a stone wall during the Chancellorsville campaign. May 1863. Victorious at Chancellorsville, Southern forces advanced north into Pennsylvania, but were defeated at the 3-day Battle of Gettysburg. The turning point of the Civil War and the largest battle ever fought in North America. More Americans died in the Civil War, 1861 through 65, than any other conflict in U.S. history. Right. I think that's the hijack. I'm not sure. Drop, you let me know. That might be a hijack. Anyway, their attempts to capture Richmond, the Confederate capital. Now, this is the single bloodiest day of the war, which was on September 17th, 1862, when the two armies met at Antietam Creek near Sharpsburg, Maryland. The Confederate troops led by General Robert E. Lee failed to force back the Union troops led by General George McClellan, and Lee escaped with his army intact. McClellan was fired. Although the battle was inconclusive in military terms, its consequences were enormous. Britain and France had been planning to recognize the Confederacy. They displayed their decisions, and the South never received the aid it desperately needed. Several months later, President Lincoln issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, and it freed all slaves living in the Confederate States and authorized the recruitment of African Americans into the Union Army. Now the North was no longer, and that just pisses me off because, that's when y'all needed help. That's when the slaves were freed. So it wasn't about him, freeing the slaves and being the hero that we were taught. No more lies, no more lies. Okay, so it freed all slaves living in Confederate states and authorized the recruitment of African Americans into the Union Army. Now, the North was no longer fighting just to preserve the Union, it was fighting to end slavery. Union forces gained momentum in 1863 with victories at Vicksburg in Mississippi and Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, and then with the scorched earth policy of General William T. Sherman as he marched across Georgia into South Carolina in 1864. By April 1865, huge Union armies under the command of General Ulysses S. Grant had surrounded Robert E. Lee in Virginia. Lee surrendered and the American Civil War was over. The terms of surrender were generous. The rebels are our countrymen again, Grant reminded his troops. In Washington, President Lincoln was ready to begin the process of reconciliation. He never got the chance. Less than a week after the South surrendered, he was assassinated by a Southerner embittered by the defeat. The task would fall to Lincoln's vice president, Andrew Johnson, a Southerner who favored quick and easy Reconstruction. Johnson issued pardons that restored the political rights of many Southerners. By the end of 1865, almost all former Confederate states had held conventions to repeal the acts of secession and to abolish slavery, but all except Tennessee refused to ratify a constitutional amendment giving full citizenship to African Americans. Now, as a result, and let me guess, Republicans in Congress decided to implement their own version of Reconstruction. They enacted punitive measures against former rebels and prevented former Confederate leaders from holding office. They divided the South into 5 military districts administered by Union generals. They denied voting rights to anyone who refused to take a loyalty oath to the Union, and they strongly supported the rights of African Americans. President Johnson tried to block many of these policies and was impeached. The vote fell short and he remained in office, but Congress would continue to wield enormous power for the next 30 years. The divisions and hatreds that had led to the Civil War did not disappear after the fighting stopped. As Southern whites regained political power, Southern blacks suffered. They had gained their freedom but were prevented from enjoying it. Local laws denying them access to many public facilities. They had gained the right to vote but were intimidated at the polls. The South had become segregated and would remain so for 100 years. The post-war Reconstruction process had begun with high ideals but collapsed into a sinkhole of corruption and racism. Its failure deferred the struggle for equality for African Americans until the 20th century, when it would become a national, not just a Southern issue. I'm going to stop right here, and we're going to start back off at growth and transformation. I don't want the videos to be too long. I know everybody doesn't have the time. Okay, so we are reading from Let Us Find the Truth. Sorry. And this is Let Us Find the Truth, the last row of the public library. And this is USA History in Brief. I'm going to stop right there.